Welcome back from lunch. If I could have your attention for a few minutes, I'd like to introduce Jerry Taylor. My name is Tim Whitehouse. I'm the Executive Director of Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility. We're a small local not-for-profit in Maryland and Virginia. Jerry Taylor is president of the Niskanen Center. Prior to founding the center in 2014, Mr. Taylor spent 23 years at the Cato Institute, where he served as Director of Natural Resources Studies, Assistant Editor to Regulation Magazine, Senior Fellow, and then Vice President. Before that, Mr. Taylor was the Staff Director for the Energy Environment Task Force at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Over the past 2 decades, Mr. Taylor has been one of the prominent and influential libertarian thinkers and voices on energy and policy issues in Washington. He is author of numerous policy studies, has testified often before Congress, and his commentary has appeared in the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other prominent print and electronic outlets. I would encourage all of you who have not visited the website of the Niskanen Center, excuse me for my pronunciation, to look at it. I had the joy of looking at it in the last week and reading the many interesting articles and blog posts that they have, and find that it's very accessible and provides very useful information on the interface of policy, politics, and science. So thank you, Jerry Taylor.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. You could have asked a lot of people to while away your lunch hour, and it's very flattering that you asked me to talk to you. It's always interesting when I get introduced in crowds like this. It's sort of like saying, today we have the pleasure of Darth Vader speaking to the group. Darth went to the College of Evil back in and then to walk through all the atrocities in Darth Vader's life and all of his missteps. I try to use my power for good rather than evil these days. I did used to be a climate skeptic, a rather prominent one. I used to be in the pages of the Wall Street Journal all the time, on Fox News, in National Review. I would come to events like this and either make your hair stand up, or I would be in debates and I would pull out the knives and talk to you about why climate change is not all that you think it is. But over the course of time, I changed my mind on these matters. And one of the reasons I left both the American Legislative Exchange Council and then the Cato Institute to start the Niskanen Center was to provide a voice for people who saw themselves as somewhat center-right, moderates, but didn't necessarily see a pathway to climate action and other policies of that nature. But today I'm going to talk largely about Republicans. And there's 3 reasons for that. First of all, they're the blocking agents for climate action. We wouldn't have this conversation if Republicans had a rapture moment and we just had Democrats on Capitol Hill. We'd have climate action, and we would be talking about the best ways to execute policies that already are going down the path we want to go. The reason that we still are in a very worrisome state is Republican opposition, so they're the crowd we have to think about the most. And in fact, it's absolutely critical to find Republican buy-in, as difficult as that may appear and as heavy a lift as that may seem. A political scientist named Frances Lee at the University of Maryland recently published a study that was very interesting about this. She looked at all the key legislative proposals that were signed into law since 1993. And she found that on only 10 occasions since 1993, in other words, 5% of the time, that we saw key legislative initiatives signed into law, did the majority get most of what it wanted without a majority of the minority also supporting that legislation in the Congress. In other words, the idea that in some glorious day, after blue wave after blue wave after blue wave washes Washington clean of Republicans, that we can enact a progressive agenda is a fantasy. It does not happen. And on those 10 occasions that Frances Lee identified since 1993, all but one of those 10 occurred during a period of unified government. If we then look at key legislative initiatives that were passed that allowed the majority to get some of what it wanted without a majority support of the minority party, you get a success rate of 12%. So the point is, if we want to enact climate policy that is meaningful, ambitious, and sustainable over time, we have to find Republican support, again, no matter how difficult and no matter how hard that task may be. And the third reason I'm talking about Republicans is it's best to know of what you speak. I've spent all of my life in the Republican Party. I'm not necessarily proud to say that, given the Republican Party today. And as you know, I've spent most of my time as a climate skeptic. A few moments about why I changed my mind about climate change, because it may provide some clues about what might cause others to change, at least those people who were, like me, paid gunslingers for climate skepticism. First of all, there's an interesting story. It was early in the 2000s. I was on TV. I forget what show it was. I was in a debate with Joe Rahm, who is a scientist today at the Center for American Progress. And I was debating about climate change with Joe, and I said, look, Joe, back in 1988, James Hansen gave testimony in front of the United States Senate and argued that if we did not do something about climate change, we would see dramatic warming. And he also provided some estimates about what kind of warming we might see. In other words, he made a forecast. And here we are more than a decade later, and if you look back, you'll find that we've only had about a third of the warming that James Hansen says we should have experienced by now. It suggests to me not that climate change isn't real, but the models are running hot. The climate's not as sensitive to greenhouse gas emissions as we thought. And that's a reason why we should probably reduce the panic level a bit here. So I'm pretty good at debate. You can see that seems pretty compelling, right? And it's a nice little soundbite. So I go back into the green room after the show. Joe comes in with me. We're getting our makeup taken off. We're getting demiked and all that. And Joe says, yeah, that thing you said about Hansen, did you ever read Hansen's testimony? I said, yeah, a long time ago. This was based on some Senate testimony that a colleague of mine gave a few months ago. And he said, yeah, okay, go back and read that testimony. He says, if you do bother, Mr. Hack, he said to me, you'll find that what you said, strictly speaking, was correct. All right? But James Hansen also gave a couple of other scenarios. He gave a business as usual scenario as he saw it, and then he gave two other scenarios, assuming various levels of climate action and what emissions and what warming might look like under those scenarios. He says, if you look at that scenario you pointed out, scenario A, the business as usual scenario from James Hansen, you'll find, yeah, it was off. You know why it was off? Because the emissions were off. James Hansen may be a great scientist. Maybe he's not that great an economist. He had a whole lot of emissions from the economy that never happened because we had a recession. We moved to natural gas quicker than he expected. And so, yeah, he expected more warming because he expected more emissions. He said, so it's not that he was wrong about how sensitive the climate is to greenhouse gas emissions. He was wrong about how much loading we'd see. He says, but if you go down that testimony, you'll see there's scenarios B and C. Scenario B, he said, offered an emissions trajectory that's pretty much what we've seen since 1988. And he says, and if you go back and look at scenario B, you'll see that the warming he projected for scenario B is pretty spot on. Pretty spot on. He says, so you know what's going on here? It took me 3 minutes to explain that, right? I don't have 3 minutes on TV to rebut you in that fashion. And that's what's infuriating about debating dishonest gunslingers like yourself. He said, so if you have any integrity, go back to your office and read that testimony, and you tell me I'm wrong. It's a heck of a challenge, right? So I went back to my office, and I read the testimony, and he was right. And I thought, this isn't good, because unlike a lot of people in my business, I really aspired to wrestle with the best and brightest of climate activists and to persuade people, not just to be the loudest howler and a monkey in some sort of zoo with a bunch of right-wingers and saying huzzah, huzzah to the things they already believed. I really believed that climate mainstreamers were wrong about being this alarmed. So I had ambitions of winning debates like this and not just scoring points for a Fox News audience. So I went down the hallway to a colleague of mine at Cato, a scientist, a climatologist, a man who gave that Senate testimony I just mentioned. And I said, let me explain what just happened here on TV, blah, blah, blah. Told him the story. I said, look, it seems to me Joe's right. What am I missing here? You're the scientist, I'm not. What am I missing in this? And he said, it turns out I wasn't missing anything. And this scientist knew darn well what he had just done in front of the United States Senate misrepresenting James Hansen. He said, I don't understand why we're having this debate. Did Hansen say business as usual would produce X amount of warming? Yes or no? I said, yeah. He said, do we have business as usual since 1988? Was there any major policy intervention? No. He says, did we see that kind of warming? No. We saw a lot less, right? Yeah. QED, why are we having this debate? Seriously, this from a scientist, not Tucker Carlson. So that rattled me a lot, because what it taught me is that I had to do a lot more due diligence than I had been doing. And a lot of the sound bites and narratives I were offering, while strictly speaking were correct, were so misrepresentative and out of context that they were not reliable. So I began to do that due diligence. And I found again and again and again and again and again stories like that. Either conscious misrepresentations or really bad science or cherry-picked data. Sometimes it wasn't intentional mendacity. Sometimes it was just a really ignorant paper. But I found that I could no longer trust the scientific narratives, and that rattled me. So that's the first thing, but I didn't immediately become the person I am now on climate change, but it definitely made me doubt a lot of what we were arguing at the Cato Institute. So I quit making scientific arguments. I made economic arguments. And even if your climate change is what you think it is, even if mainstream climate science is correct, the cost of removing fossil fuels from the economy is greater than the benefits that are achieved by doing so on a fast pace. And that was a legitimate argument. There were real economists in the world who were making that case. But as low carbon energy became more and more economically competitive, that argument bled away. And as we learned more and more about climate science, the fat-tail distribution of possible outcomes became so much more dangerous that that argument likewise had really cut into that proposition. It got to the point where I literally, and this is what I did at the Cato Institute for a living, so I can vouch for this, I literally could not find a single credentialed economist in academia who published in the peer-reviewed literature on climate change who would argue against aggressive climate action, usually via a carbon tax. Not one single economist anywhere. Now remember, the qualification is publishes in the peer-reviewed literature. Oh, I could find an economist who went to George Mason University on a Koch scholarship, who's now at Appalachian State College, who teaches at the Free Market Chair for Entrepreneurship, who does not publish in the peer-reviewed literature on climate change, but who's got lots of opinions about it, right? I can find people like that. But we're supposed to be a little bit more serious at Cato, and I wanted people who actually were engaged in that literature, and I couldn't find any. And that rattled me as well. And then I saw a paper from my friend John Adler. Now, John Adler used to have my job, sort of, at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is still, to this day, a hothouse of climate nuttery. But back then, John Adler was somebody who agreed, we were in the same boat. He went to Case Western University, got his law degree. Now he's an academic. He teaches. He's out of the think tank world. But he wrote a paper, but he's still kind of a libertarian. In 2007, he wrote a paper, which I thought was really interesting. He said, you know what? Even if everything climate skeptics say is correct, and by climate skeptics, he means the better ones who don't deny something called global warming. They don't deny that greenhouse gas emissions warm the planet. They just believe it will have less of an impact than most scientists think. He said, even if those guys are right, including the guy I'd mentioned I worked with at the Cato Institute, he said, even if they're correct, since when do libertarians get into the habit of saying, if party A destroys the property of party B, but A makes a crap load of profit, then B's just got to suck it up and take property losses? Okay, cost-benefit analyses like that, utilitarian calculations like that, are reasonable arguments to make. I mean, people make them. But libertarians shouldn't be in the business of making them. Libertarians are in the business of arguing that my property rights are inviolate except under extreme conditions. And given that fact, the only real job government has on this earth is to protect my property rights from violations and takings from others, period. And if Koch Industries or ExxonMobil or Murray Coal or what have you want to emit greenhouse gases and warm the planet and destroy my property, well, they should be enjoined from doing so, but if we can't go that far, they should at least compensate me for damages. At least do that. And a carbon tax would be a means of doing that, right? Well, I thought this was I'd never thought of it that way before. You think this is kind of obvious, but motivated cognition being what it is, I had never really quite thought about it that way. So I sent the paper around to some of my colleagues in the libertarian and conservative world and said, what do you think about Adler's paper? And it was kind of like sending out Martin Luther's encyclicals to people in the Vatican and asking what they really thought of Martin Luther. And at that point, then, I just didn't want to talk about climate change at the Cato Institute. I talked about other things, but I was really uncomfortable with this debate because there was no room for Cato to move into a different direction on that issue for reasons that we can discuss in Q&A if you want. But finally, what finally broke it for me was a guy named Bob Litterman. Bob Litterman was the first quant on Wall Street. He founded the risk management shop at Goldman Sachs. He was a partner there when they went public. He's a wealthy guy. But he's also extremely well thought of as one of the top risk management professionals in the world, not only within the business community, but within academia as well. Turns out Bob's something of a soft libertarian. He wanted to talk to me at the Cato Institute about climate change. He's on the board of World Wildlife Federation, Resources for the Future, a few other places. So I took the meeting with a colleague of mine, and he said, look, I'm really frustrated at this debate that you're having. I don't mean to be a scientist, so I won't have a scientific argument with you. So, but the point is, you're on the wrong track. You're arguing about what the most likely outcome from climate change is, right? You think it will be on the low end of the distribution of possible outcomes. Mainstream climate scientists think it'll be in the middle or higher end of the distribution of possible outcomes. And you guys are in a white-hot fight about that. He said, look, I've managed risk at Goldman Sachs all my life. And the risks I manage in other contexts aren't that different from the kind of risk management exercise we have here. We don't know exactly what will play out from different scenarios. We know there is a wide distribution of possible outcomes. And at Goldman Sachs, when we're looking at financial risk, we don't look at what the most likely outcome from this investment or this economic move might be. We look at the full range of possible outcomes, and we price the risks associated with these moves. Because if we didn't, and you just looked at the most likely outcome and said done and done, you wouldn't need Goldman Sachs, right? I mean, you wouldn't. Because you know what the most likely outcome is in any given year. You know, you should park your money in a mutual fund and be done with it. So, but we know that people pay to hedge against risk. And climate change is a non-diversifiable risk at that. It means there's nothing we can invest in that will pay off if we get climate change. Nothing. He said, now in markets, how do people respond to non-diversifiable risk? Well, there are such things outside of the climate arena in my world, and I can tell you what, they pay like hell to avoid non-diversifiable risk. So if we looked at climate risk like we looked at any other risk in a marketplace where government's not telling us what to do and we called it something else, he says, I know what people would do. They would pay heavy to avoid climate risk. That was a really powerful argument coming from a free market guy at Goldman Sachs. And so it was at that point that there was nothing but rubble at the end of my climate denial rainbow, which is why I'm here today. I'll return to that story a little bit later because it provides some clues about how to move conservatives on climate change. But let's go back to that topic of how to move Republicans. A lot of people who are in audiences like this where I give a talk say, oh my God, this is a lot of retail work. Have you ever seen a Fox News viewer? I mean, how do we talk to the Republican Party when they're driven by a anti-science, anti-knowledge, crazed base? And we can't expect to move the party until we can expect to move the base. And how the hell are we supposed to win an argument with Sean Hannity or something, or Rush Limbaugh or something like that? Well, I'm here to give you a little bit of good news. There is no such thing as firm, fixed, coherent public opinions in any particular arena ever, anywhere. Climate change, healthcare, Russia. There is no such thing as informed climate change, as informed public opinion. You can go all the way back in the political science literature to find a mountain of evidence to this effect. The best book is from Philip Converse all the way back in 1960 called The American Voters. He found that there is absolutely no sign whatsoever there are any foundational ideologies in the American public, and that knowledge of politics and policy is abysmal. All right. So our job is not really to change minds in the voter base at large, because there aren't minds really to change. Their minds are elsewhere. Now, this is, for amongst political scientists, this isn't a very controversial thing to say. But for people outside of political science, it sounds like the most elitist, offensive, anti-democratic thing you could possibly offer, right? Well, look, I used to work at the Cato Institute, Alex, so I'm an old hand at that. But if you don't believe me about the radical ignorance of the American public, I will refer you to a survey done in 2015 by a firm called Public Policy Polling. They asked primary voters in both parties whether they would support bombing Agrabah. 1/3 of Republicans favored bombing Agrabah, 13%, however, were opposed. 36% of Democrats were opposed to bombing Agrabah, but 19% favored it, and with the rest having no opinion. If you didn't know, Agrabah doesn't exist. It's a fake country. In fact, it was the only time we know about it was from the 1992 Disney movie Aladdin, where Agrabah featured prominently. So my point here is that 43% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats, just so you don't think this is simply a Republican problem, when they were polled, they had an actual defined view of bombing a place in a cartoon. So where does public opinion come from, if not from the neurons that run through the mass public? A book back in 1992 settled this conversation definitively, and in my opinion, once and for all. And in the political science arena, it is likewise as orthodox and bulletproof as anything you're going to find. The book was written by John Zoller. It was called The Nature and Origin of Mass Opinion. And what he found is that public opinion is simply a pale echo that takes some time to play out of what elite cues might be. Democratic opinion is what Democratic elites tell them Democrats should think. Republican opinion is simply an echo of what Republican elites tell Republicans they ought to think. There was another tremendous book just adding more nails to that argument by a political scientist named Gabriel Lenz. He wrote a book called Follow the Leader. What he found is that voters decide who they support and who they want to champion based on kind of like an intentions heuristic. Donald Trump says he wants to make America great again. I want to make America great again too, because I think it sucks right now, and so he has the right ideas. The point is, people decide who to embrace, not based on whatever their policy views are, and then they adopt the policy views of the person they decide to embrace. All right. So it's not like they have this mental checkbox. I believe this on abortion, this on guns, this on prayer in school, this on tax cuts, this on health care. What candidate is closest to me? Oh, he is? Okay, I'm over there with that guy. No. That's maybe how we think, maybe how you think. It's how I think. But it's not how 99.9999% of Americans think. All right? And that's why politicians are the ones who form the base. The base doesn't form the Republican Party. A great example of this, if you doubt me, this was from Zoller's book, where it first came to my attention. Back in 1971, way back in the day, President Richard Nixon decided to impose wage and price controls. Now, can you imagine that? Just as an aside, a Republican using executive authority, never giving Congress that he could do it. Can you imagine a Democrat doing something like that? Be amazing. But this firm was polling Republicans about 2 weeks before Nixon made that announcement and asked Republicans how they felt about wage and price controls. And as you would expect, only 37% of Republicans supported wage and price controls, right? The rest opposed. As you would expect them to do. God did not put them on this earth to regulate the wage and price of signals in the American economy. And then Nixon makes a surprise announcement from the White House. And the polling firm said, oh, this is a great natural experiment. Let's go back in the field and see how Republicans feel about wage and price controls 2 weeks, within 2 weeks of that speech. Let's see how they feel. This time, 82% of Republicans supported wage and price control. Right? Now, another example. In 2015, May of 2015, just before Donald Trump came down the escalator in Trump Tower and declared his candidacy, Pew surveyed the Republican base about how they felt about free trade. Are free trade agreements been good for the American economy? 51% in May of 2015 said yes. That question, when asked again by Pew in August of 2016, the month that Donald Trump received the nomination for the Republican Party in Cleveland, now only 24% of Republicans said free trade has been good for the American people. Now, I could tell this story over and over, and I don't mean to tell it just about Republicans because there's nothing unique about Republicans. You could tell this story about Democrats as well. And in the climate arena, we see exactly that. A sociologist named Robert Burrell from Drexel has done several studies on this in which he's done intense regression analyses to see how do you explain movements in Republican opinion on climate change. Because despite what you may think, Republican opinion on climate change has historically moved around quite a bit. It's not a flatline scream of denial. in the 2000s, Republicans showed a lot of support for climate. Newt Gingrich was on TV with Nancy Pelosi talking about the need to pass cap and trade, right? The Republicans nominated John McCain, and the platform he ran on for climate change could have been written by Hillary Clinton. I mean, so there was a time Republicans felt differently. You say, well, what explains that? Is it how much money the Kochs were spending? Is it, what the media coverage was like? I mean, Earth in the Balance and Inconvenient Truth. Does that have an impact on Republican opinion? Is it extreme weather events, hurricanes, droughts, things like that? Is it campaign money? Is it how much Heartland's doing? He looked at all various possible explanations we hear a lot about, and one of them was what Republican politicians were saying. And he found that that's exactly it. How Republican political elites were discussing climate change had the most impact. In fact, it explained all of the variance in Republican opinion on climate change. So, my point here, before I move on, is that telling stories to Republicans, at least at a retail level, so a Republican in Dubuque, Iowa, a Republican in Schenectady, New York, that is at odds with what they're hearing from trusted political elites in their party, is to swim against an extremely strong tide. You will likely get nowhere. Questions? No, I'm just kidding. But there's a good side to this, right? Because, all right, so doing a retail conversion exercise on Republicans on climate change is probably spit into the wind. But it means that electeds aren't so constrained by the base, right? The party makes the base doesn't make the party. So there's something here, right? Does this mean that elected officials have way more leeway than we think? Yes and no. See, one of the things about climate change that makes it interesting is it's a low salience issue. Both with Democrats, that's a problem, right? It's not treated like other issues in the Democratic litany of things that we're supposed to care about. It's always low on the survey list of things you care about relative to other things. And it's that low saliency that makes climate activism a difficult thing in grassroots politics. But its low salience also works in our favor, because also people who are animated against climate change is kind of low on the list of things they care about. So in 2008, I guarantee you, it's not that the Republican base were a bunch of mini Al Gores, and that's why they elected John McCain for the nomination. They probably didn't agree with John McCain all that much about climate change, or sure as hell wasn't why they're Republicans. Nobody becomes a Republican to fight climate change. I guarantee you, they're there for a lot of other reasons. Climate change isn't it. But they thought, you know what, I care a lot more about these other matters that McCain's going to be my champion on than I do on climate change, so I'll give him a pass on that. I'll live with it. That low salience means there is more room to move Republican electeds than you think. And, but that's for the big fish, for the guys who have the nomination, Donald Trump and John McCain. They can move the base a lot. For lesser political elites, they're a little bit more constrained. And if you need any proof of that, look at Jeff Flake's death spiral in the state of Arizona. He's speaking tremendous truth to power, he's doing it eloquently, and he's lost his career over it, right? So it's not as if lesser elites have that kind of power necessarily. So when we think about them, political scientist David Carroll has it about right. Politicians are in the business of managing coalitions of policy demanders that are anchored in their party. And the Republican coalition demands opposition to climate change and threatens rebels with primary challenges if they buck these instincts. And Bob Inglis is a great example of that, former congressman from South Carolina and a friend of mine who famously lost a primary race in 2010 against a Tea Party opponent to some extent over his support for a carbon tax. And so the thing is that these demanders within the party for climate denial may not represent the base. The base, there's not much to represent there. They don't really have opinions. But they're highly motivated, animated, and influential in the party. If you cross them, they can make you pay. But on the other hand, it's important to remember that politicians also have leverages on coalition members, because let's assume the party were to move in a somewhat different direction. A coalition member has to decide to open guns on its allies and friends in the party, or even threaten to walk out. And that has very steep costs. So for instance, if Republicans were to tell oil, gas, and coal industry types, Charles Koch and others, look, we're losing points on climate change, we're losing it with millennials, we have to act just out of self-preservation, if nothing else. You think ExxonMobil's going to start giving money to the Elizabeth Warren campaign for the presidency? I don't. Do you think Charles Koch is going to all of a sudden start funding the Bridge Alliance, No Labels, Third Way, or the Move On, or hashtag Resist? No. They don't have a lot of places to go. So in fact, there's a rich literature in the political science world about whether coalitions of demanders, well-organized coalitional interests, hijack parties, or whether parties actually hijack the coalition members. So they do have some degree of influence as well. But what's important to remember is that it may seem odd to you that climate denialists have this kind of power since they don't have very much support even in their own party. The party itself is kind of neither here nor there. And if you've seen public opinion polls on climate change, you find that 70% of the public is in favor of climate action. So where does all this influence come from? Well, because if you're in a coalition in a political party, you are highly organized, highly motivated, easily turnoutable. I mean, the NRA is a perfect example of that, right? The NRA's power is not directly a result of how much money it hands out. Its power is that its members will turn out like psychos to destroy anybody in their path. They'll walk over their grandmother's grave to knock out somebody who crosses the NRA. That's what gives them power. And that's what gives these coalitional interest power. And politicians will tend to defer even to these minority opinions, as long as the cost of doing so isn't so great that they lose support elsewhere. And given how little people pay attention and how low salience climate change is, usually it doesn't cost Republicans anything to listen to the climate denialists. So what our task then is in communications is we want to talk to coalition members to change their own position. And we want to talk to conservative elites who inform the opinion of coalition members in the party. And we want to talk to the politicians who fear that catering to the denialists has more political costs than benefits. Now, within the GOP, the coalitional members that are our problem in descending order of power is Charles Koch and his political apparatus. And I can tell you just as I move quickly through this list, I don't believe that Charles Koch is motivated by business interests. I don't. Most people in the major oil and gas sectors have made their peace with climate change, made their peace with the carbon pricing. They have various iterations of support for a carbon tax, and I believe those opinions are, for the most part, honest. They weren't always, but I believe they are now. So if it's in Exxon's interest to have a carbon tax, and BP's interest to have a carbon tax, and Royal Dutch Shell's, why would it be in Charles's? Exactly. The thing is, having known Charles Koch a little bit, since having worked at, I was in the Death Star up there with those guys, I can tell you that I joke because they're not evil. They're just very ideological. Charles is an extremely ideological man. And his opposition to climate action is based on the idea that to do anything meaningful about climate action, you have to take fossil fuels out of the economy with huge economic costs. You're going to have to regulate every nook and cranny of human existence, and it will fundamentally rupture, if not break, capitalism. And capitalism is the greatest engine of wealth creation and human well-being we've seen in centuries. And that is a more valuable thing to hold on to. And we should resist all efforts to ruin the economic engine of human well-being that we have experienced. That's why he takes his position. It's an honest position. Of course, he covers it up with a lot of science denialism, but that's a different story. So he's the number one problem, and my own suspicion is he's not movable. But then again, he's losing power in a Trumpified GOP. His Tea Party got creamed in 2016 when it made tentative efforts to oppose Donald Trump. He found out that the guys he thought he was controlling at the grassroots defected from him in about 5 seconds and became Trumpists like that. So it's as if you built this whole army and the first sign of gunfire, they all defect to the other side. Well, that's Charles Koch in the GOP. Now, he's got a lot of influence in the establishment right now because his guys are in the administration. That's a whole different story. But the point is that Koch and Tea Party power ain't what it used to be. How much it's degraded remains to be seen. Then there's coal. Surprisingly enough, even though Bob Murray at Murray Coal is extremely influential in Republican circles, to tell you a little story out of school, when Republican members of Congress get together, they talk about energy policy, and we go to these secret weekly meetings of Republican actors who meet with leadership to hear what the agenda is for this week, and that sort of thing. When conversations about energy come up, there will inevitably be some congressman in these closed-door sessions who says, what does the big guy think? Big guy being Bob Murray. So, of course, coal is, for obvious reasons, opposed to climate action. But they are losing market power, and they are losing economic influence, and they're going bankrupt, and they're being buried by low-carbon energy, and they are disappearing from the economic scene. They're facing a hard landing whether climate policy goes forward or not. So they're on borrowed time. They're not what they used to be, and tomorrow they won't even be there in the first place. Then there's the oil and gas industry. Little oil, always going to be opposed to climate action. They're the small wildcatters and the vertically deintegrated actors. But big oil, the guys you're usually worried about, no. Big oil wants regulatory certainty. Big oil is afraid of liability considerations. And if they're ever held liable for climate damages, they're done. And they would love to have this issue buried and done with. And they think a carbon price is their best strategy because gas is a pretty competitive economic fuel in a carbon price arena. And if you get carbon capture and storage, it can actually survive indefinitely in a zero carbon economy. And they know that if they don't strike a deal while the striking is good, the Keep It on the Ground campaign is probably going to gain strength. The guerrilla warfare at the local level against infrastructure investments for the oil and gas industry is going to continue to be a Vietnam for them. They'd rather settle this on their terms and use market forces to get this job done. I believe those positions are largely legit. And then there are conservative activists and elites. The people I used to work with, people like me. They're the fourth, least important as terms of coalitional power, but in a sense, maybe more important than all since they have formed the opinion of everyone else. Charles Koch and his nuttery on climate didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of places like my office. So I'm talking to you about how to chat with conservatives and how to communicate. And I have to tell you, good luck to you if you want to talk to Charles Koch, Bob Murray, or somebody at ExxonMobil. It can be done. We're doing that in Niskanen. But their position's not easily moved by the likes of you. So let's focus on conservative elites, a crowd that you can talk to. Why do conservatives oppose climate action? It would seem to you there's nothing obvious about why, right? How you feel about free market economics and the rights of man should have absolutely nothing to do with how you feel about atmospheric physics. And it shouldn't, but it does. The main reason that we have a problem today is that climate denial has become a norm of tribal identity in the Republican Party. It is an expression of loyalty to Donald Trump and Team Red. Straight up. It didn't used to be that way, but it is that way now. We've gotten into a pretty bad place. So when you get these naked assertions that climate change is a fraud cooked up by commies and academia who hate capitalism, who are just trying to like turn us back into a pre-industrial pastoral state where we can dance with wolves and get incensed with our non-materialistic inner, ka, well, that comes from a naked proposition that I'm a loyal Team Red member. And right now, loyalty to Donald Trump and Team Red is sort of like a tribal cred that now is identified with climate denialism. Secondly, conservatives are fed a steady and heavy diet of denialism and conspiracy theories 24/7 by the right-wing media establishment. There is epistemic closure here. If you are a right-wing activist and if you listen to anything other than Fox News, read anything other than the Wall Street Journal, get your pornographic political thrills from Breitbart and InfoWars or Alex Jones, you're a rare bird indeed. They simply are not paying attention to anything outside of those arenas. They are not like the rest of us. And I don't say that because I say they're stupid or ignorant or anything. I mean, imagine it. Imagine if you didn't know that everything you were reading in the New York Times or the Atlantic was concocted nonsense, that it was made up, that it was based on, you don't know that, right? You believe it to be true. Conservatives feel the exact same way about Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and Fox News and Breitbart and their world. That's the truth of it. And that's unfortunate because it leads to epistemic closure. Third, climate scientists are from academia, which is suspect as a readout of socialism and anti-capitalism. They're also elites, and academic elites are poison to Republicans and conservatives, and it's not just climate scientists. Whether you're an economist, a sociologist, it doesn't matter if you're from academia, you do not have credibility with the Republicans. Because they believe, and not entirely wrongly, in fact, they're right to some extent, that the academy is largely a bastion of left-of-center political and intellectual thought. It is. So they distrust everything that comes out of it, right? Just like you would distrust anything that came out of the National Review. Maybe some of you wouldn't, but, or anything that might come out of you from a Fox News commentary. Just like, oh, come on, I'm not going to listen to Fox. Well, that's how they feel as well. Climate action also demands joint global action. That's poison for nationalists, and nationalism is running rampant through the GOP right now. So we're going to get together with people and hold hands. Good luck with that. And again, they believe that most people who want climate action are like watermelons. They're green on the outside and they're red on the inside. And you know what? They don't entirely make that up. Some of them are. I mean, I used to make a living out of things like paying attention to Al Gore's books, Earth and the Balance. And oh, if I wanted to cherry pick it, I could. And I did beautifully. And by the way, I don't necessarily have to cherry pick. I could hold up Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, which is a clarion call for why climate change means capitalism is done. And it has to go. I can find that stuff. I mean, it's out there. That doesn't mean it's typical, and it's not. I've met a lot of climate mainstreamers, and they're not Naomi Klein devotees. So anyway, how do you talk to these people? Well, let's first of all talk about what doesn't work. Dodging climate change in favor of talking about clean energy. No. This is very trendy in my world. Don't talk about climate change with Republicans. That just scares them. Let's just talk about the virtues of clean energy. How far has that gotten us in 30 years? Have we decarbonized the economy that way? No. No, we haven't. And that's what's required. The root and branch removal of all fossil fuels in a few decades. And it ain't going to happen by having a few clean energy tax credits. It'd be a nice thought, but it ain't going to happen. You can't ignore climate change because the policy ambition required to address it is tremendous. And it's not going to be gained from dodging the topic. Nor do you do yourselves any favors by dodging denialist rebuttals on the science and just talking about the consensus. Now, most people don't realize the scientific consensus is as strong as it is. And there is good evidence to suggest that if you point it out, it is a good argumentative point that can even move people like me when I was on the side. But when I was in these debates, I can tell you, I don't know how people from Dubuque, Iowa, or anybody else, I don't mean to pick on Dubuque, Iowa. I'm from Iowa, so it's an easy reference for me. But when you listen to communication specialists, they're always there, and there's good research on this. If you just try to, pick on each of the arguments the denialists make, you reinforce their perspective in the audience, that's all true. I'm not arguing against that. But amongst elites, the people you want to talk to, when you dodge, it looks like you have no answer. I can't count the number of times I heard the aforementioned colleague of mine who was a climate scientist peddling crap. In retrospect, I know it for what it was, but then I didn't. And I'd see him in debates with climate scientists, real good climate scientists. And this fellow would lay out, this study, this argument, this contention, blah, 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 blah. And then the climate mainstream would stand up and he would ignore every single point that was made and say, most of these arguments don't move in academia. There's a scientific consensus. And I looked at that and says, well, if there was anything wrong with what I just heard my colleagues say, I'm sure you would have flagged it, and you didn't. And all you're doing is saying, but we had a show of hands over here. And the show of hands says that they're not persuaded. That doesn't change elites' opinion. You have to tackle climate nuttery point by point. Third, what also doesn't work is to make the case for massive socioeconomic transformation. If you read Bill McKibben, talks about World War II style, transformation of society. That's great. Republicans didn't think they were put on this earth to completely radically transform the economy in short match, and by the way, give up meat and all kinds of other things. All right, it's a major challenge what we face. But the more you emphasize that, the more you're scaring your audience. Overstatements with regards to certainty don't work. Look, a doubling of background levels of CO2 from pre-industrial levels might cause warming from anywhere between 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius. That is a huge range. That's a huge range. There's all kinds of tipping points which may or may not come into play. To talk as if we know the answers to a lot of uncertain things is to walk into a trap that I used to live by. And finally, identifying climate action as a bundled progressive agenda is death. Look, it's hard enough to get conservatives who want to tackle climate change. But if you're going to make them also sign on to Bernie Sanders' campaign agenda, forget it. Like an example of this is Becky Kelly. She's the president of the Washington Environmental Council. She said in the course of debating climate taxation in Washington State during a ballot initiative back in 2016, she said, quote, "Viewing climate change as an environmental body of work is way too limited. It's not really an environmental issue. It's a broad sociological and economic issue. Climate change is not environmental policy. It's everything policy." Well, good luck. They're not going to sign up with #resist. It's hard enough. You can't make them embrace progressivism as a precondition to talking or acting about climate change. So what does work? I've given you a lot of it, but there are things that do work, and I'll finish up my few minutes here because I've overrun my time, and I do want to give you a chance to ask any questions you might have. First of all, messenger counts more than message. This is just human nature, right? People listen to those who they think share their values, their morals, and who look at the world the same way they do. That's human nature. It's not just Republicans. So you have to speak their language. Russian. I can't ever resist that joke. But the point is that you need to find conservatives, or you need to be a conservative, or you need to talk conservative, or you need to like go into a lab and create one, or you got to give me money so I can do it. The point is that sending your local Susie Cream Cheese from Greenpeace into a congressional office to talk to a Republican is death. Secondly, solution aversion. Look, most people oppose climate change because they don't like the consequences of embracing it. If I believe that there's climate change, we have to address it, does that mean I have to destroy capitalism? That means I have to embrace the entire progressive agenda. Does that mean that I have to regulate every nook and cranny of the economy? Does this mean? No. The point is that if you can make climate solutions conducive to the pre-existing moral worldviews and values of listening, you got a way better chance. And it turns out that doing something about climate change is actually pro-capitalist, is actually pro-free market. It actually gives more benefits than costs. It's to do it through pricing, which is what most economists want to do, is to say that we should use capitalism and price signals to decarbonize rather than EPA regulators. And if we do that, we create more wealth and we accelerate our move to clean, low energy, low carbon economies. That's the sort of thing you have to keep in mind, that the solutions to climate change are what scare conservatives, not climate science per se. Risk management also works. Look, Republicans know about risk. In every other area, they're proponents of the precautionary principle, right? Except when it comes to climate. I'll give you an example. After 9/11, you may recall there was a brief period of panic in the United States about what would happen if Pakistani scientists gave nuclear weaponry or know-how to al-Qaeda. And there was a lot of conversations about what do we do? You know, this is prior to the invasion of Afghanistan. What do we do about Pakistani nuclear weaponry and those fundamentalist scientists that we are suspicious of? Dick Cheney said on Meet the Press a few months after 9/11 this, quote, "If there's a 1% chance that Pakistani scientists are helping al-Qaeda build or develop a nuclear weapon, we have to treat it as a certainty in terms of our policy response." Wow. Imagine if we were talking about climate change, right? So the point here is that when you talk about managing risks and say, look, it may not be that bad. We don't know, but it could be really bad. We have to assume the worst because the price of being wrong is the end of the planet. It's turning us into Jurassic Park or the planet Venus. That's what it means to be really wrong about this. We need to hedge our bets. And if hedging our bets means simply giving a cleaner environment to our kids by moving into low carbon energies faster than the market might otherwise have taken us, which is where we're going anyway, then that seems like a fairly reasonable move. And that counts a lot to conservatives. And there are co-benefits, as I mentioned. You know, getting rid of fossil fuels also means cleaning the air, cleaning the water, and it turns out people care a lot about that, even Republicans, believe it or not. So let me end there. I have probably gone on far too long, and I hope I didn't depress you too much about the lift that you're facing. But the reality is that I'm actually somewhat optimistic about the future course of this debate in the Republican Party. We can talk about that in Q&A, or you can just watch the news and see all the wonderful things I think are going to be happening in the not too terrible distant future. So thank you very much. I'm mostly optimistic because Vladimir Putin seems to be changing his mind about climate change, and he's the most important actor in Republican politics today. I kid, sort of.
Thank you for that most engaging talk and for keeping us awake during lunch when our sugar levels were telling us to go to sleep. I had a question for you about communicating uncertainty, because I think you pointed out that that's very difficult, especially when you're talking about science. So how do you proactively address that issue when someone says to you, yeah, but that data is uncertain or you don't have the whole picture? Because we face that consistently in public health.
Yeah, you just turn it around. I mean, yeah, there's a lot. I mean, first of all, I don't think there's any good reason to deny uncertainty, because it does exist. And you walk into a trap from people like me who just made a living out of filleting people who talked about the certainty of, the end results from climate change. But it's the uncertainty that means we need to concern ourselves, right? Look, we don't know what's going to happen if Kim Jong-un gets a missile that can hit an American city. We don't know. He might use it. He might not. We don't know. But that uncertainty is not an argument against acting or hedging against the risk. The fact that it is uncertain whether if we play dice with the planet, we might crap out and burn the place down is not an argument against acting. Nor is it an argument that says, I don't know what the exact odds are that we're going to turn this planet into Venus within a couple of centuries. Is it 74%? Is it 81%? I mean, when Scott Pruitt says we just don't know precisely the impact of what climate, what the chances are that we're going to see these scenarios play out, he's not wrong, but he's being extremely disingenuous. We're debating the fine points of 81 versus 96 or something like that. I mean, there is uncertainty out there, but it's that uncertain. What's uncertain is about whether the planet's going to fry or not. All right, let's be very clear about that. And by the way, I doubt the oil and gas industry is going to really come out really good if it does. I don't think the capitalist system is going to survive if the planet doesn't. So that uncertainty is a cause for action. It is not a cause for inaction.
I've just got a quick question. Throughout your talk, which was really entertaining and fun, you talked about a carbon price, you talked about a carbon tax. Obviously, I'd love to hear your thoughts about going back to the 2000s. We kind of made this grand gesture, and we let the CEI, we took the liberal perspective took on the cap and trade as a way forward. And obviously, we look at what's going on in California, having adopted cap and trade. It sounds like you have a different vision going forward, and does having $1 trillion hole in the budget provide an opportunity for something else?
It may. You have to remember, politics is in a constant flux, and it's constantly changing, and outcomes from 10 years ago aren't necessarily great guidelines for the outcomes that we might see in the next few years, because the political terrain is always changing, and we're always looking backwards at a world that doesn't exist anymore. We've got a different world. I can tell you, looking forward, most Republicans don't care that much about the debt right now. They might in the future. You would think that asking Republicans to impose a tax is just asking for dogs to dance and monkeys to do math, right? I mean, it's just not what Republicans do. But on the other hand, that's not entirely true. Ronald Reagan raised taxes 11 times during his administration. I mean, Republicans have raised taxes before. And the Republican Party today doesn't look like the kind of party that's going to do it. But the Republican Party today is not going to look the same after November. And I doubt it'll look the same after 2020. So things can change. And as far as the ability to impose a tax, oh, God forbid. I mean, a lot of people I talk to in Washington, we have arguments about should we embrace this or that or whether, and the carbon tax is so hard. It's like, you know what? One thing Republicans and conservatives know full well, because it bugs them to no end, is that if you tax a corporation, most people think taxing a corporation means making the CEO and the stockholders pay, and screw that, I'm not a stockholder, I don't work there, right? That the tax, where you put the tax is the place where the tax is paid. Most people think that. It's wrong. We know that if you tax the company, it's going to pass on those costs to the consumers to the extent to which it can. And in most, though not all cases, it means full transferal of costs to consumers, right? But most people don't think that way. That's why if you look at public opinion surveys, say, do you support higher corporate income taxes or higher taxes on companies and corporations? They always do. Always, even though they want lower taxes generally. Why? Because they think it's the companies that pay the tax. So if Republicans would simply say, look, we're going to tax these companies that are putting this planet at risk, and then we're going to take those revenues and spend it to try to save this place and to compensate you for higher energy costs to try to pass it on, that seems like a fairly reasonable argument to me. It may not be something that's going to pass in this particular Congress, but I don't think it's impossible to imagine. And you also should keep in mind, if you think the idea of Republicans imposing taxes on corporations is, again, more, crazy talk, that was part of the 1986 tax reform. Ronald Reagan increased taxes on corporations. It's been done by Republicans before.
Hi, Jerry. Good hearing you again here. I think the only libertarian ever to come to Johns Hopkins twice to talk about climate change policy. Two quick questions. First, The the carbon tax that you say the oil and gas industry has accepted, is it large enough? Are they talking about a number that's high enough? And secondly, what do you think about the role of campaign finance reform in getting to sensible policy?
Well, let me take the latter first, because it's a pretty easy one to dismiss. I do not have firm opinions about the impact of campaign finance law on the political world. I think it's a complicated and hard to resolve debate. So I'm just putting it out there that I have no firm fighting interest in the conversation about campaign finance law, though I'm interested in the topic. But it doesn't matter, because if you can envision a world in which a Republican Supreme Court reverses Buckley versus Vallejo or Citizens United, then you're dropping acid. It's not going to happen. In other words, this isn't simply a matter of whether Congress will or will not pass a campaign finance reform bill. These are Supreme Court decisions about the rights of speech that constrain Congress's ability to act. That doesn't mean there aren't possibly good things states can do and legislatures can do, but the idea that you are going to put the genie back in the bottle and shut Charles Koch and Bob Mercer and every other plutocratic mega donor up, or the Chamber of Commerce or whatnot, through some magic, elect enough Democrats, ain't going to happen. So forget it. The political world is not what we wish it to be. It is what it is. And in that world, Charles Koch and Bob Mercer and people you don't like are going to be in American politics. The only thing I would say is don't think that they have as much power as you think. Donald Trump spent virtually nothing, and he wiped out Jeb Bush with about $100 million, okay? So it doesn't settle everything. As far as, what was the first part of your question? I got excited about that one, so.
You said oil and gas industry has accepted a carbon tax, but
is it high enough?
is it a big enough number?
Right now, the effective carbon price is about zero, so anything above zero ought to champion you folks. There is no climate policy of any consequence at the federal level. Now, the optimal carbon price would probably be 6 figures. It's not going to be 6 figures, because we live in the world of the here and the now, and even Senator Whitehouse and Senator Sanders, when they put out their carbon taxes, they didn't go above 40. All right. The number that the Climate Leadership Council is looking at, this is an organization directed by my friend Ted Halstead, who founded the New America Foundation, and is made up of ExxonMobil and BP and other corporate actors. They're looking at something around a $40 carbon tax, which is pretty darn high. Whether they adopt it or not, I don't know. My guess is that the most likely scenario for congressional action, based on what we're hearing from our Republican allies, is somewhere in the low 20s to start, with escalating clauses. And if you say, well, is that high enough to do the job? It depends on how close you think low carbon energy is to knocking out fossil fuels. In other words, if you're a techno-optimist, in other words, you like Bloomberg New Energy Finance, another Bloomberg name up there. They're energy consultants. They probably have one of the best track records in the industry. If you believe that the green energy economy of the future looks like BNEF says it's going to look like, a $25 carbon tax is done and done. It will decarbonize the economy roughly on the pace we want. All right. If you think that low carbon energy is not even close to being competitive with fossil fuels right now in any conceivable world, then no, $25 isn't going to get you there. But if then you ask the question, how much will regulation get us there? Because part of a carbon tax would probably be a trade for regulatory authority, which was first forwarded in the Waxman-Markey bill. So it's not a trade environmentalists haven't offered before, right? Give us a carbon price and we'll get EPA out of the business of regulating greenhouse gas emissions when the tax falls. Well, right now, the effective regulatory, if you were to try to match that regulatory apparatus you're removing, you'd probably only need a carbon tax of $14 a ton to do that. And that's being optimistic. All right. Well, I shouldn't be calling somebody else as the microphone, so I apologize.
Yeah, I had a quick question. So I think a lot of the climate debate is somewhat a matter of packaging and marketing, and that there seem to be some issues, especially in the public health field, that really seem to stick in the craw of the Republican Party, and others that kind of pass and don't seem to create as much of a stir. So kind of looking towards the future, as more things become apparent, there are larger issues. How do we avoid having some of these become such hot button issues so that this debate can move a little bit more fluidly and not become so sensationalized in some ways?
This is largely out of your control. To some extent, you can park responsibility in the environmental movement for producing the world we're in. To the extent that, look, one of the nice things I've had since I went from evil to good, as you might put it, as I put the Darth Vader mask aside, and embraced the Force, was I got a chance to meet Al Gore, who I'd never met before. And I'm actually impressed and I like him. He's not the person I thought he was back when I was on the Death Star. But having Al Gore as the leading public spokesman for climate action is making it absolutely impossible for you to have a conversation with the Republicans. Just is. Likewise, Leonardo DiCaprio, who I've yet to meet, though I'm trying to do that. Leonardo DiCaprio is not a guy who conservative Republicans are going to say, God, Leonardo DiCaprio, how awesome. He wants me to act, right? If it was Clint Eastwood, yeah, if you get, or, something like that. But then again, you can only go so far. Look, Arnold Schwarzenegger used to be the darling of the right too, right? Until he wanted to do something about climate change, and now he's like freaking Chairman Mao or something to the GOP. Who knew? So the point is, you can do some things, like if I were, in the high command of the environmental movement, which, alas, I am not, I would be desperately searching for Republican, nonpartisan people who are not identified with Bill McKibben or Tom Steyer or Al Gore or that old regime to be my champion. That's what I would be killing myself to do. Right? But it's not so, but there's only so much you guys can do. If Donald Trump decides to weaponize this issue as an identity matter in Republican politics, you can't do anything about that. You can't. And he made that decision. He didn't have to. He could have been elected without. In fact, Donald Trump could have been the exact opposite position on climate change. We'd have a whole different conversation. He would have taken the Republican base with him. Look, the man had signed petitions to act against climate change before. His opinions on climate change, like just about everything else except Mexicans, is pretty light and immaterial, right? He's been everywhere on all issues. He doesn't have any firm fixed opinions about anything. And he could have decided, look, if he would have played more of a central populist, he could have easily been on the other side. But he chose to go the other way. And there's a lot of reasons he chose that, and I won't get into it unless you really want me to, and I'm probably running out my welcome anyway. But since he made that call, it's not like, if you had only done something different, or maybe the Republican Party. No, it's out of your control.
So I guess, thank you for your comments. So looking forward then, you mentioned November. Are there specific places where this conversation with conservative leads should be happening, or ways that we in this room, like specific things we should be thinking about with November in mind, given what you said today?
Well, there are a lot of things I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you all. So I have to be careful about what I say. Niskanen, for what it's worth, we are relentlessly, our main audience for our policy work, besides smart people like you, are elected members of the Republican Congress, their chief staff members, their committee staff members, and everybody they listen to. We are relentlessly focused on Capitol Hill. All right, we're not about waging and winning the war of ideas, and once again, the aforementioned Dubuque, Iowa, as worthy as Dubuque, Iowa may be. Since our theory of policy change means it's all about elites and elite cues and where party leaders are, that's where we go and do our business. So we spend a lot of time with the Republicans. And I think there is an extremely good, though not certainty, but an extremely good chance that before the summer recess, you will see a carbon tax bill with Republican members of the House as sponsors that will not pass, and it will not have a massive number of co-sponsors. The co-sponsors will probably likely be under a dozen. But it'd be the first major Republican piece of legislation from anywhere in the party in over a decade. And it's a conversation starter, and it's a marker. So in the near term, what you can do is, if and when we're actually able to execute this lift, these members need cover. I mean, in the Republican Party, you're probably not buying yourself any friends by embracing climate action. And whomever you're running against, if you're a congressman or woman in the Republican Party who wants to do climate change, you're probably facing a Democrat who will see you and raise you 20. Or 10 or 5 or something like that. So it's pretty hard if you're talking to a member and you're talking to a Republican why they should act on climate change. It's like, all I'm going to do is annoy my base and my friends, and I will gain nothing because my Democrat is always going to outbid me on this no matter how far I go. And #resist, I'm a Republican. So how many progressives or members of Sierra Club or Citizens Climate Lobby, are going to vote for me on climate when they want Paul Ryan's head on a stake and they want Donald Trump run out of Washington with an impeachment operation? So these folks a lot of the Republicans that we're dealing with who are leaning towards climate action are in competitive political districts. And I'm not asking you to go ahead and sign on their campaign programs or do ads for them or give them campaign contributions. But if this actually goes forward, they're going to need all of the help they can get, understanding that they can get, and support that they can get. And I would hope that you'll be able to provide some of that and help inform them as well, because we're in the business of educating these Republicans. I think we've done a fairly good job, but we can always do better, and many of you are in a better position to educate them than I am.
Great, thanks. We do need to move on, but thanks again, Jerry. Okay, so we are transitioning now to the panel on public health tools for decision making. So I'll ask Pat to come up as the moderator for this session.
So as we're transitioning, Jerry, I have a suggestion for the spokesperson, Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton, I think, could really work. So I'm going to do something a little different than the first session. I'm going to introduce all three speakers now, and then I can sit down. That way I don't have to come up, bob up and down. And if the speakers can come up in the order of what you're introduced, and then we'll all retire to the stadium, to the table at the front. So the first speaker will be Suzanne Condon. I've known Suzanne for a while. In fact, she's currently serving as a special advisor to the director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control's Center for Environmental Health. Who could that be? And so I've worked with her closely over the years, but she was previously Associate Commissioner and Director of the Bureau of Environmental Health at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, from which she retired in 2015. So when you look at her, you have to say, how come you're old enough, you're not old enough to retire? The second speaker is another friend and colleague, Keisha Pollock Porter. And Keisha is President of the Department of Health Policy Management and the Director of the Institute for Health and Social Policy at the School of Public Health. She uses mixed methods. When I first read it, I thought she used some methods that were mixed. But I don't want to do that malapropism. So she used mixed methods to inform policies that create safe and healthy environments where people live, work, and play, and travel. And finally, someone who I've known since I was a student here at the School of Public Health, John Links. John Links is a professor of environmental health and engineering in the School of Public Health, with joint appointments in health policy management, radiology, emergency medicine, public safety and leadership, civil engineering, and business. I think that's got to be a record for the most joint appointments. Dr. Links directs the Johns Hopkins Center for Public Health Preparedness and is currently Baltimore City's terrorism and pandemic influenza planning expert. His interests include public health preparedness, response for all hazards, ionizing radiation, biomarkers, mathematical modeling, and non-invasive imaging, and I left one of his important affiliations out. He's currently serving as the Vice Provost and Chief Risk and Compliance Officer for the university, which is a big job. So I'd like to start by inviting Suzanne Condon to come up.
So just the down arrow. Hit the down. And your timekeeper is right there. Timekeeper is. I'll be my own timekeeper too. Okay. Thanks, Pat. Just a little bit. You can tell the range of height and back and forth. No. That's what, I'm good. I'm good right now. So I have 15 minutes to talk about, with 10 slides, very specific guidance from the conference organizers, to talk about 3 subjects which I think are each could take 15 minutes each and of themselves alone. But I'll do my best to stay on track. As with anything you do when you work with CDC, whether it's in a part-time capacity or full-time, there is a disclaimer. Everything I say today has nothing to do with anybody's opinions other than my own. So these are not the opinions of CDC. But given that we have a mixed audience, people from different backgrounds, I wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page in terms of, what is public health surveillance? And so CDC defines public health surveillance, and it's been constant since 1986, although they've published many documents since that time. Public health surveillance is systematic, ongoing collection, management, and analysis, interpretation of data, followed by the dissemination of these data to public health programs to stimulate public health action. Hence the title of my talk, Using Data to Drive Public Health Action and Policy. I think probably the person that I have quoted the most during my career when it comes to public health surveillance is really Dr. David Satcher. Satcher put it best back in 2011 when he said, surveillance is where public health begins. We can't do anything in public health without surveillance data. And I think that it was words like that, and at that time, that led to the creation, I'm looking around for Shelley Hearn too, for the Pew Commission report that Tom Burke mentioned earlier today, that helped launch the CDC's Public Health Tracking Network. And essentially that is a network of, well, we've gone back and forth over the years. Is the network the people or is the network the data? I say the network is all of it. Currently, CDC has funded 25 states across the country and New York City to do active surveillance through its tracking network. And so this is the array of outcomes that are available on the CDC portal. But I want to say over the years, there's been debate, particularly amongst those of us at the state level who have, very clearly got strict confidentiality. I think Gina Solomon mentioned it this morning. We are bound by confidentiality laws. We have to be very careful how we present data, particularly on a publicly available portal. And I think there was, some thought early on among some of my colleagues that I had the good fortune to work with at CDC, that there might be this data sharing in a way that would provide confidential data across this very, what ultimately is a very public portal. And so I think that's not whatever could have happened, but what did happen, and what I think is one of the real wonders of the CDC tracking system is their ability to work across states and work with state partners to collect data that will ultimately drive policy at the federal level as well. And one of the latest examples of that is a new publication that just came out looking at air pollution and respiratory morbidity data for populations under 65, using emergency department data from 17 states. CDC was clearly able to demonstrate associations between particular days of high ozone and particulate matter 2.5 levels and emergency room visits, notably among children. They're now also testing the utility of electronic health records, which I'll mention a little bit more about in a minute. But Tom Burke asked me if I would talk a little bit about some of what we did when I was in Massachusetts. And I think I challenged a lot of my colleagues at the time that we were building the tracking portal in Massachusetts, because I believe that we could obey those confidentiality laws and still provide data at a granular enough level so that it would be useful to all sorts of players, policymakers at every level. And so we developed the cancer mapping tool in Massachusetts. It right now calculates standardized incidence ratios for 23 different types of cancer. It displays the pattern of rates at 5 different levels of geography. Some of these are important to the state government in Massachusetts, like Health and Human Services, that wants data available within their specific regions. But we also made sure that we had data available at the census tract level, the lowest level that we could get, that wasn't going to breach any confidentiality issues. It also has spatial layers that allow you to pull together other geographic information system sites like environmental sites, school information, because we have school-based asthma on the portal as well, look at population density, and a variety of factors. And I will say that in terms of how the data have been used, in Massachusetts, this has been such a successful initiative that our state environmental protection agency partners actually adopted some of the data, and they're using that to drive state policy as it relates to the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act or citing decisions in the state. So they're using that granular data and taking into account health impacts that might come as a result of development and other initiatives underway in Massachusetts. I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the things that was probably the most difficult law to implement for those of us in the public health sector. That was Massachusetts Transportation Reform Law back in 2009. And it required the state health department, as a member of the Healthy Transportation Compact, to establish methods to implement the use of health impact assessments. And I know Keisha's going to talk more about what HIAs are in a minute, but I will say that if it weren't for the public health tracking portal, we wouldn't have been able to implement this law as well as we did. One of the nice things that came as a result of this, we did a pilot test of a very large transportation project in Massachusetts where we used a lot of health data in a parallel way to the transportation planners, taking different sets of data, but in a complementary way, and we both ended up with the same alternative designs. And so it's true, we can satisfy different missions and accomplish the same goal by working together. I always think of Megan Latshaw when I talk about biomonitoring. A lot of people aren't as familiar with biomonitoring data, but biomonitoring is simply the measurement of environmental toxins in the blood and urine of people, and CDC does a fantastic job of this in terms of making comparison data and other information available for us, and that's been invaluable to states. If you ask laboratorians, why is biomonitoring important? And they'll tell you, when they really look at something like risk assessment, they say that biomonitoring is most important because it tells you how much actually gets into people, not your best guess based on in media levels what somebody might be exposed to and what their blood or urine measurements might be. So we used biomonitoring to address a very important issue in Massachusetts a number of years ago, and we did this in partnership with EPA. I remember our colleagues from Region 1 EPA came to us and they said they wanted us to help them wrestle with the Baird McGuire Superfund site. It was a National Priority List Superfund site, meaning that it's one of the more important ones in the United States. It was a chemical manufacturing and pesticide mixing plant that operated from 1912 to 1983. There was just massive contamination. It contaminated everything, river sediments, the areas where children recreated, groundwater, surface water, you name it. So EPA wanted to clean up this site as quickly as they could. The problem was that 14% of the contamination was arsenic. So when EPA proposed to use incineration as a method of remediation, you can imagine how well that was not received by the community. The neighbors were concerned about health impacts. They were really concerned about their children's health. At the same time, we had done so many risk assessments and looked at health data that we were very concerned about the cancer risk being so high. So we, at the health department, wanted to clean up the site. We weren't necessarily fans of incineration, but at the same time, the contamination was so massive, we knew that they had to move. So we worked with EPA to design, and the community, to design and conduct the childhood environmental study. We did two things. I didn't add this to this slide, but the community never believed that the incinerator would burn at 99.999% efficiency. So I convinced EPA to pay for a billboard to be put up in the center of town that always showed what the temperature of the incinerator was. So people had a good check on, you know, okay, it's doing what it's supposed to do. At the same time, EPA also provided funds for the state health department to take measurements of arsenic in the hair and urine of children who lived in the immediate area of the site. We wanted to be able, this wasn't an experiment on children, this was basically done to demonstrate that what we believed to be the case, that there would be complete destruction, would indeed be the case. And if not, if there was ever an indication that children were being impacted, that we would shut the incinerator down. So the good news is it burned as we thought it would. That site is well in its, I can't tell you how much the property values went up in that community because it's quite a nice area right now. But this was an example of successful collaboration between EPA, the community, and the State Health Department in a way that I think we're talking about doing at this meeting. We need to have different types of data, different players involved in a collaborative way, and understand what the goal is before we start. Just a quick note on the idea of enhancing the systems that we have in place today. I'm a firm believer that electronic health records and electronic laboratory reporting are going to be solutions for the future for environmental health practitioners and others that need input from us in terms of doing their work. Many people think that it was the Affordable Care Act that called for electronic health records to be made available, but it was actually the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It basically put the onus on healthcare providers to establish and demonstrate meaningful use of electronic health records by January of 2014. Not everyone has done a great job at that. Many parts of the country have. So we're in a position where I think we might see the fruits of those labors in the very near future. And one example that I think is important to consider is one that I think people have mentioned a few times today, the idea of the perfluorinated compounds that have impacted water supplies everywhere. I can tell you whether it's because I am at CDC and Dr. Bricey's office sometimes, but more importantly, I just see it across the country. Everyone and their brother is asking CDC to do a multi-million-dollar study. There's only so many dollars available, and what's the best way to design that study? Well, I think that we can use some of the data available across environmental regulatory agencies and through electronic health records and laboratory reporting to help do some kind of a screening process to help us design the best sort of study that we might be able to do. And so I firmly believe that because many of the health outcomes that we're interested in are available and routinely collected at provider office visits, and that EPA has really good data on what's, I'm sorry I use this acronym, but UCMR is the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. Basically means that it's not really it's not a regulatory type rule, but it's one where EPA says you have to collect data. And so I think if CDC's public health tracking program could gain access to electronic health records and associated laboratory data, it might allow for more ready preliminary assessment and for us to address public health concerns. So finally, in conclusion, that I believe that CDC's public health tracking and biomonitoring programs provide important baseline data and resource support for state and national surveillance programs and efforts to address local concerns. As public health tracking continues to mature and is better understood, I think its contributions are being realized more fully, particularly in relation to air pollution impacts on health, for emergency response actions, and to explore the utility of electronic health records. In terms of this meeting, cross-sector collaboration is paramount in order to promote health and ensure optimal public health protection. No one can do it alone. We've got to do it together. We've got to get the right data in front of the right decision makers and players. And I think that non-sector health agencies could work with local and state health department partners to determine current data availability within their geographic areas and identify projects where surveillance data, including the use of EHRs or electronic health records, might best address environmental health impacts. So I think I stayed within my 15 minutes. I'm going to sit down. Thanks. Look forward to the discussion.
While my slides are getting pulled up, I'll say it's great to follow Suzanne. I first met Suzanne many years ago at the very first National Health Impact Assessment meeting maybe 2013, 2014 or something, so it's terrific to be here. Thank you very much. Pull my slides up. Okay, great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for those who replied, Tom. Excited to be here today. I have the honor and privilege of giving you a very brief overview of health impact assessment, which I believe is a really important tool for public health decision making. And I know some of you in this room are familiar with HIA, and some of you are less familiar with HIA, so I hope that by the end of my talk, you will have a good overview. And I did stick to my 10 slides. I wasn't sure if the title slide counted, but it's 10. So Tom set me up really well this morning because, you know, I often wondered after we heard about what happened in Flint, what would have happened if we had considered those public health impacts up front. What would have happened if our decision makers would have asked what could have happened to the public's health and to health disparities and to health equities before changing the source of the water supply? Would we have avoided what Time magazine called in their cover a couple of years ago, the poisoning of an American city? I believe that we could have. And I believe that one way that we could have highlighted those public health impacts was through the use of health impact assessment, or HIA. So here's the formal definition of health impact assessment. This came out of the National Research Council. There was a special commission put together in 2010. I was one of the reviewers of the report. And this group came up with this consensus definition of what HIA is. And HIA is a structured process that uses scientific data, professional expertise, and stakeholder input. Stakeholders broadly defined, the community, decision makers, policymakers, to identify the public health impacts before the decision is made. So this is the real sweet spot. It's looking at what could happen to public health so that we could maximize those health benefits and mitigate those health concerns. The other important aspect of health impact assessment is that we take that data to translate and make into recommendations. And again, our goal is to minimize those adverse health impacts and maximize those positive ones. HIA, the field, is built on a number of key values. They're listed here. I want to highlight equity. The analysis of our health impact assessment analysis in and of itself highlights how those health impacts could disproportionately affect some of our quote-unquote most vulnerable populations. Health impact assessments address those determinants of health. So when an HIA is done, HIA is asking, how does that proposed policy, plan, or program affect housing or parks and natural space, transportation, education, and lead to health outcomes? When I talk to people about HIA, they're sometimes like, how come I haven't heard about this? Well, just to give you a sense of where we are in this country, as of January 2018, there have been over 400 HIAs that have been either completed or are in progress in the United States. These data that were used to populate this map came from the Health Impact Project, which is a collaboration of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Pew Charitable Trusts. And Health Impact Project is the leading organization funding HIAs, helping to grow HIA practice. I've been a consultant with the group since 2013. I want to highlight some of our HIAs in Maryland. There have been 7 of those. I teach a class on health impact assessment, and our class works on a real issue every year, and we've contributed to a few of those HIAs. There have also been 10 HIAs done on federal level decisions. We've worked on a couple of those targeting decisions in education and housing, just to name a few. So of those 400 or so HIAs, this is how they break down by sectors. Most have been targeted to decisions affecting the built environment, but we also see decisions around natural resources and energy, social policies related to living wages, for example, labor or employment. Tamara O'Laughlin is here in the back. We just last week, 2 weeks ago, we were in Annapolis together testifying for a bill that would have required a rapid health impact assessment here in Maryland for all decisions coming out of the Public Services Commission. So again, decisions related to utilities and thinking about how we can look at those potential health impacts before the commission makes those decisions. Here are just a few examples of HIAs that have been targeted towards broader environmental health issues. There was a HIA that came out of Massachusetts, actually, around the LIHEAP program, or the Low Income Housing Energy Assistance Program. And that HIA helped to show how low-income families were disproportionately impacted by this policy that would have reduced the amount of resources they had for utilities. So you saw analysis showing the impact risk of burns, for example, in house fires, because families were using their ovens to heat their home, or other types of risks. HIAs can also be applied to policies, projects, or programs. Let me highlight the project listed up there. That community school rehabilitation project is notable because it's one being led by the EPA. And so if you know Flo Falk there, she is leading that health impact assessment. It has a team of individuals that are conducting health impact assessments on decisions. When we think about HIAs, these things don't have to be massive, comprehensive projects that take 2 or 3 years to complete. HIAs can be completed in a number of a range of scopes. So from very, very short, we consider those desk-based or desktop HIAs that might be completed in just a couple of weeks, all the way through to more comprehensive health impact assessments. The amount of time, staff, the scope of the analysis, the methods, all of those vary. And the other thing that varies is the level of stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement is critical for health impact assessments, and we see these more desktop or desk-based HIA just involving fewer or a lower level of community engagement or stakeholder engagement, all the way through to comprehensive HIAs that may involve collecting your own data. One HIA we worked on, for example, of proposed changes to a provision of the Farm Bill, we did focus groups around the country with individuals who would be affected by those decisions in the Farm Bill. So in summary, here's a few key points about health impact assessments. This is just a nice summary slide. HIAs are conducted on a very specific decision. All right, so we'd like to see HIAs being baked into routine considerations and processes in government agencies, for example, but in HIAs on a very specific decision. HIAs use a broad analytic framework. Every HIA I've ever read will involve a literature review. Some will involve collecting qualitative data, quantitative data, using advanced modeling, system science, and a few. But again, you're using an array of methods to try to determine how health could be impacted if that decision moves forward. HIAs also involve collaboration with stakeholders. I already mentioned stakeholders here are broadly defined. So we think about the people who would be affected, ranging from the private sector to community residents to decision makers. HIAs are not about an academic exercise. These are pragmatic and focused on solutions. The recommendations are steeped in science and are made to help, again, maximize those public health benefits and mitigate those public health negative implications. And finally, HIAs address health equity. Again, that at its core, the HIAs focus on the determinants of health, and they show how health could be disproportionately affected, or how communities can be disproportionately affected if the decision moves forward. So in terms of opportunities and next steps, I encourage all of you to learn more about HIA. I just finished teaching a course here in the 3rd term about health impact assessment. I also encourage you to connect with organizations that do trainings. And organizations can be hired to come in and do trainings with their teams about how to use this decision-making tool. I want to point you to 3 resources on this slide. The first is the website for Health Impact Project. Again, a great resource. That map I showed you is a searchable map on their website. You can look for HIAs related to a number of sectors and read about them. There's also a professional society, the Society of Practitioners of Health Impact Assessment. SOPHIA is the acronym. And that's an organization where we are providing technical assistance and mentoring to individuals who want to get connected to HIA. And finally, this cover on the right is of the minimum elements and practice standards. HIA, there's a field, and we have guidance on what constitutes an HIA, and if you want to do an HIA, what are the elements that should be included, and what are the practice standards for the field. So thank you very much. I believe I'm on time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm John Links. It's great to be here. What I'd like to do this afternoon is assert that systems thinking and systems modeling are the only ways to fully tackle the challenges that exist today that we're all trying to solve. Those challenges are so complex, so dynamic, so nonlinear, that the only way to keep in mind and carry consciousness for all of the factors that are influencing the problem and therefore the solution or solutions to the problem is to use systems thinking. So what I'd like to do is start by defining what I mean and what really all of us mean by systems thinking. Then I'll just give you one example of a project we're working on. So systems thinking is the process of understanding how things influence one another within a whole. And by a system, we mean a group of interacting, interrelated, and interdependent components that form a complex and unified whole. Systems thinking had its foundations in systems dynamics, and I'm going to talk in a moment about system dynamics modeling, formulated by MIT professor Jay Forrester by now decades ago. So a system is composed of parts. All parts of the system must be related directly or indirectly, or else there are really two or more distinct systems. A system can be nested inside another system. A system can overlap with another system. A system consists of processes that transform inputs into outputs. A system is a dynamic and complex whole interacting as a structured functional unit. And energy, material, and information flow among the different elements that compose the system is the hallmark of both systems thinking and the modeling of that system. Okay, so let's start with a trivial example of a system. You have a population in the middle, and the question is, what are the factors that influence population size? You obviously have births driving an increase and deaths driving a decrease. And so you can set up a system that identifies the components around population, and fertility becomes a reinforcing feedback loop on birth rate. Mortality is obviously a balancing or feed-forward loop on death rate. And by thinking in these terms, so I have a birth rate, a death rate, population size as a dynamic, not static variable, and I have additional concepts of fertility and mortality, I have mapped, in this case, a pretty simplistic system, but what I've done is two things. I've identified the important factors that are driving the output of interest, in this case, population size, and I've also determined the interconnections between those components. And for me, I don't know how to understand a problem, and I particularly don't know how to understand intervention opportunities, which ultimately is the name of the game, if I can't draw some sort of framework, model, concept, a picture that simultaneously identifies the components, the interrelations between those components. Because I could walk up and point to various points on that diagram and say, that's where I can intervene in one of the following ways. Okay. So the example I'm going to use is a model that we call Copewell, and this is a collaborative effort between two centers at the school, the Center for Public Health Preparedness and the Center for Health Security, along with the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware, colleagues at CDC, and some independent consultants. And what we set out to do was to use systems thinking and system dynamics modeling to model how a community fares during and after a disaster. And we've applied the model that I'll show you in a minute at different geographic scales. Here's the model applied to every county in the US at the county level to give a color-coded map of resilience, which is the output of interest, the time course of functioning of that community during and after a disaster, and then that transformation into the concept of resilience. So I'm not going to talk in great depth about the model. I just want to use it as a prop for illustrating what we mean by a system, systems thinking, and systems modeling. So this is the picture of the model that we use in Copewell. And this picture is both a conceptual picture for conversation about disaster resilience, and it's literally the picture of the computational model that we use to produce the quantitative outputs. So in the center of that picture is a big vat of blue liquid, which represents the level of community functioning at any point in time. And in our model, community functioning has to do with the provision of services to the inhabitants of a community. We therefore have a set of domains through which jurisdiction provides services to its inhabitants. Those are shown in the orange box on the left. And the quantitative values in each of those domains set the pre-disaster level of community functioning. That is how much blue liquid you start off with. If you look at the bottom of the slide, there's a pinkish box labeled event. That's the disaster event that is going to impact the community and its functioning. And the characteristics of the event determine how much a valve, which is that circle with an X in it, gets opened. And the more that valve gets opened, the more that precious blue liquid that represents community functioning flows out of the community into some sort of sink where it's lost. We have a set of factors on the left in those blue boxes that we call resistance factors. And these are factors of the community. Some are population factors, others are other factors that we call prevention mitigation factors, characteristics of the community that fight the opening of the valve by the disaster. So the better off that community starts out in terms of functioning, the more blue liquid in the tank to begin with. The better off the community starts out in terms of these resistance factors, the less impact a disaster of any size inherently is going to have on that community. Then at the top of the slide are what we call recovery factors. This is the replenishment of community functioning once there's been a disaster. And we happen to have 3: social cohesion, formal preparedness and response activities, and an influx of external resources. And you'll note that there are valves that control the flow of blue liquid from those 3 reservoirs back into the community, and those valves are themselves controlled by a combination of community factors as well as how much community functioning was lost. Because in any disaster, the mobilization of resources to replenish community functioning is driven by the loss of community functioning, right? You have a worse disaster, you have greater external resources flowing back into the community and so on. Now, here's the point. We can take a picture like this and use it as a picture to have a much more systematic and structured conversation in a community about what we mean by disaster resilience, what the factors are that drive resilience, and what the intervention opportunities are, because they're at multiple places in that diagram, starting with enhancing pre-event community functioning itself, moving on to those resistance factors, which you could take one by one, and then equally looking at the recovery factors and building those reservoirs of blue liquid so they're staged to flow back into the community functioning reservoir. So we can have, in the absence of data, a much more structured and systematic conversation about the problem and about possible solutions. But the other thing we can do is to then use data to populate all of those constructs in the model and run a what-if prediction across a variety of different disasters, different events that we would have as input into a system dynamics computational model and get quantitative output. And we can start with any community's actual data to the extent we have it. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then we can intentionally perturb those elements of this system that can enhance resilience. And we can ask cost-benefit questions. If I put certain resources towards any one of those boxes, how much bang for the buck do I get versus putting resources towards other boxes? Now, a moment ago, I mentioned data, and in a sense, data is what links all three of the talks in this session. It's really, really hard to get the right data. And that was one of the shocks for us in this project. Because, for example, pre-event functioning, we're looking at measures or indicators of how a community is doing broadly. This is a very whole-of-community approach. And yet we can't get good data to represent these fundamental functions that a community is supposed to be delivering to its inhabitants. And so we've also been working with jurisdictions. Here's an example with our work with New York City, where we take measures or indicators that are available in New York because they like data and data-driven decision-making that may not be available in a systematic way across the country, and get custom results for that jurisdiction. It also enables us, in this case, instead of using a geoscale equivalent to the 5 boroughs, to have 42 much finer geographic areas representing the United Hospital Fund areas that New York collects a lot of data in. So in terms of systems thinking and systems modeling, the benefits, in my opinion, are that it facilitates holistic thinking, it identifies interactions among components of the system, and it makes visible subtle and non-intuitive or counterintuitive non-linearities in the system. The barriers are challenges in identifying all system components and interconnections. But I would say, if you can't do that, you really don't understand the problem you're trying to solve. And challenges in obtaining actual data to quantitatively characterize components and connections. Thanks.
Okay, so we do have a few minutes for questions.
Got a question up here up front, Dr. Frumkin?
Thanks. Great presentations, all of them. This is a question for Suzanne and Pat on tracking. The tracking system, I think it's fair to say, is architecturally roughly the same as it was when it started 15-odd years ago, maybe with the addition of EHR efforts. But in the last 15 years, there's been a radical transformation in the data that are available to us as a country, this tsunami of new data sources. Google Street View on neighborhood conditions, Walk Score on walkability, satellite data on tree canopy, smartphone capture for travel behavior, customer preference cards for dietary patterns, Google searches for symptoms, Facebook for people's inner emotional lives. There's a lot we can now study. So the question is, if we didn't have a tracking system and you were starting it from scratch now, what would you do differently than what was done the first time round?
You want me to go?
You want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think you're right, Howie. When we first started this way back when, I mean, that's right after the release of the Pew Report, we had nothing to start with. We had we had CDC sort of in its infancy with developing data systems. We had states that, we had demonstration states, if you recall, in the early on, because we needed to have some people that had some data infrastructure capacity even attempt to show that they could build systems that would develop linkages. I think if I were to have been in that seat many years ago, I think I would have done a lot more intense job slowing down. I'm a firm believer in sometimes slower is faster. At doing a sort of survey of what's out there, what's available, and then building up from that. I think what we tried to do at the time, and I won't, I think that the tracking program has matured and has grown and has done some fantastic things. Having said that, I think that if we had spent more on the IT end of things early on and looked in an exploratory way at what might be available to us and built on that first, we'd probably be in an even better place today. Because, I think, and I look at myself, I've been building surveillance systems my entire career. It's probably why I was one of the first people funded to work on this. But we basically built on what we already had that we thought we could do. And so I think that was probably, something we could have done a better job at years ago. And would do it differently today.
So just a couple observations before we kick it back to the next question is, also remember that the Pew report originally said to do this right would require $170 million a year, something like that, for tracking. Tracking right now is budgeted at about $35 million a year. So there was a big gap to start with between what the vision was and what the resources were, as you know. But you hit on an important point. It's time to rethink tracking. And what does it track? And what are these new opportunities? So it's something we're beginning to take on at CDC. So you're absolutely right.
Hi, Valerie Zartarian from EPA Office of Research and Development. A comment and a question for Keisha regarding HIAs. So I was involved in the Harena School project that you mentioned that my colleague, Dr. Flo Folk, had led. And I think that the table that you showed was really helpful, that showed the range of screening level to higher tier, the screening versus comprehensive HIAs and the differences. And I just wanted to make the comment that some of the lessons that we learned from that project were how important it is to clarify up front, because I think sometimes when people say HIA, some people have in mind that very clear 6-step, formal process and are very familiar with that definition and, how important it is to follow that prescribed approach. And others, when they say health impact assessment, it's more of a, informal. So I think just, clarifying that right up front and what level, depending on the timeline, depending on the questions being answered, that's really important, as well as the roles and responsibilities of all the stakeholders on the project. So the question that I had for you is of the 414 HIAs that you showed on that map, which is very exciting to see, that number growing over time. Do you see room for more quantitative science being brought to the assessment step of an HIA? I was wondering how many of those 414 are more qualitative versus quantitative, because when I was involved in the HIAs, I think one of the constructive criticisms of HIAs in general is that they can be too qualitative. So, in my view, that assessment step in particular could bring more modeling, more data, et cetera. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments on that.
Great, thank you for your question. The first thing I want to say, just in response to your comment, is you're absolutely right. The scoping step of the HIA process is critical to really define expectations for the decision makers and for the team in those roles. And for any of you who are interested in HIA, the scoping step, there are tools out there to help you think through all of those steps. I also agree with you in terms of an opportunity for more advanced methods in the assessment step. I was really excited to hear your talk, and I think that there's lots of opportunities to use system science and systems modeling more so in the HIA process. At the last HIA practitioners meeting, there was a work group around methods, and we talked about that. We've also talked about room for more economic analyses. Very few HIAs do any kind of economic predictions, and that's what policymakers want to know, right? If this decision happens and these are going to be the health impacts, what are the costs of those health impacts? And we really haven't been able to point to good examples. There's just a handful, and the same thing with advanced quantitative methods. So I do think there's room. I can't give you an exact percentage, but I'd say a small percentage of the 400 plus have used advanced modeling.
Question on the right.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. My name is Michelle Roberts. I appreciate your comments. I just wanted to know what level of your studies were actual what we would call legacy fence line, environmental justice, living cumulatively impacted communities were engaged. My question for that, and the reason for asking, is that we have a number of communities across this nation, and while this work and all of your works are to be very commendable, and I'm very excited to hear all of this awesome work, there's a false sense of hope I'm here to share in communities where they are being bombarded with permit after permit after permit after permit after permit on top of societal. I don't need to tell all of you, you're all very bright and accomplished people in here. So my question is now, with all of this brilliant data and works that you have, how do we now make sure that what happened in Charleston, West Virginia, what is continuing to happen on St. Lawrence Island in Alaska, Mossville, Louisiana, and on and on and on and on and on, cease to exist? So that's the big elephant in the room. I'm sure it's an easy question because we're all accomplished people in here with this brilliant technology and studies. So can you tell me what I'm supposed to share with Christine Bennett from Mossville, Louisiana, who asked me to bring a question like that to you? Thank you.
Sure. Well, I can tell you, so it's interesting. We were asked, when I was still in Massachusetts, to do a health impact assessment of a biomass energy facility. And unfortunately, by the time we were asked to do that, the community was so enraged over the idea of this plant even being proposed that I think it wouldn't have mattered what we came up with. But I will say that through negotiations and through discussions with both the community and the industry proponent that was trying to build that facility, he actually did agree to do fence line monitoring, to do all sorts of things that I think would have helped to address the community concerns and reassure people. But by then it became a political football, and it was just, the train had left the station. So I do think that some of this work does take that into account. Unfortunately, I think it's still in its infancy, so I don't think that I don't think people are using the tool with the appropriate timing in the kind of way that would be most beneficial to the community. And I say that, I mentioned this transportation HIA that we did in Massachusetts. We did look at quantitative data. We basically predicted that if we didn't pick a certain alternative, that we would have lots of little kids that were already, the obesity rates were enormous in this community. We needed to improve walkability and the whole, community design issues. And so, it was good that we came up with sort of the proposed project in the way that we did. But I will tell you, there was such angst on the part of our transportation partners that we basically were doing an HIA of a road that will be built. I hope I'm still alive when construction starts. But it was a 20 or 30 year out project. So I think we are a long way to go, but I think that's been the struggle I've seen with HIAs right now.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I would just add to what Suzanne said to say, tell Christine in Louisiana that there are many communities around the country that are demanding HIAs and that are holding their decision makers accountable to look at these health impacts. I do think up to 400 plus, it's a small percentage, but we're seeing community members asking for equity impacts, asking for equity-focused health impact assessments, working with researchers in an authentic way where they are collaborating to generate the science that then are are objectively collected that are then used for future advocacy efforts. And so I can think of a number of examples where communities around the country are using that tool. I do think there's room for more, but I am excited by the potential when I can think of a number of organizations that have used HIA to help bring data to the decision-making process and to the debate, and also for continued monitoring once the decision occurs.
I'll just add one observation. I think we use the word community a lot without necessarily being sure what the community is we ought to be using that word for in a given context. And I'm just going to suggest that I'm not talking about different geographically contiguous groupings, I'm talking about different scales. So depending on the size of the problem and the size of the solution, a community might be a country, or a community might be a neighborhood, or even something smaller than a neighborhood, or anything in between. And one of the things I think we ought to be better at than we are is thinking simultaneously at different geographic scales at what we mean by community.
Great.
Dave?
Yeah, last question.
I really appreciate the comment, Suzanne, about surveillance and its importance. My name is David Dijak. I'm with the National Environmental Health Association. And what we're seeing is a growing role of the private sector, invited and uninvited, related to data collection systems. And I'm wondering how we corporately react to that. For example, there's a group out of New York has a website called iwaspoisoned.com. And this is where people report real-time their own sense of foodborne illness and where they thought they got it. And I looked at the vendor community collecting data in collaboration with local environmental health programs and local health departments all across the country. They compete with each other. So this idea of an integrated approach is really becoming less and less likely as time progresses. Is there anything that you would recommend that we do to try to lasso that in, or do we just watch it proceed into the future?
Sure. So I don't know if I have been a strong proponent my entire career of community involvement, and when I say that, I mean people who are most locally impacted by the decisions that we make at the government level. I think we just have to develop stronger partnerships, Dave. I think that, I was a person who was in charge of many things at the State Health Department, including things like foodborne illness. It's horribly underreported. At the same time, I remember having some of the food folks that work for me say, well, I did an intake from this guy who said he had foodborne illness last night. I asked him what he had to eat. Well, he said he had 3 shots before he had of some alcoholic beverage, before he had a cheeseburger that he knew was what made him sick. I mean, so there's debates all over the place, but I think we have to better partner with people that are collecting the kind of data and talk about the sort of pros and cons of that. And I also think, though, that citizen science, there are sort of places where data gaps could be filled if we did a better job of partnering. So I don't think there's a universal answer to that, but I think that as government researchers, we got to do a better job than we've been doing, because I think there are people that are trying to fill those gaps if we don't figure out how to fill them for them.
Any other responses from the panel to that question? Okay, if not, then thanks, Pat, and thanks to our panelists.